Well, good morning, my friends, and welcome to Bensalem Baptist Church Livestream Devotional and the Source of Truth podcast. We are glad that you have started your week off with us on this cold, wintry week as we're looking forward to all kinds of winter weather. And so we are so glad that you have joined us and are part of this. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to be part of your day. And so we're going to be in Genesis chapter 40 today. The passage we're going to look at here in just a moment is unique in the aspect of the story itself, the account is a larger section. Frankly, it covers the rest of chapter 40. And I don't necessarily, I think there's so much information, so many principles we can pull out that to try and cover that in one episode is too much, especially in 15 minutes we tried to make the devotional. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start slowly taking small chunks out of this over the next few episodes as we evaluate this. And some of them are going to be longer as we look at the breakdown. This passage deals with the two dreams that the butler and baker had and how it worked. So I'm going to just take just a few moments and an introductory thought to talk just a little bit about the faithfulness that we see in Joseph here. Now, in a second, we'll read the verses we're going to look at today, but I want us to understand a premise that I think is important as we go into this. It's kind of where we're headed with this. I have mentioned from the beginning that I didn't believe that Joseph was blessed by God because he was good in the midst of a series of unforeseen circumstances, where God's plan was this, but it didn't work right because the brothers got in the way. And so even though this wasn't really God's plan, all these things kind of just randomly happened. But Joseph was good and obedient and faithful, and so God blessed him and somehow used that for his good. That is not what I believe happened in this story. As a matter of fact, I believe that it was God's plan for it to happen this way. And so everything along the path is still how God was going to make it work. Doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always seem to be easy for Joseph, but that's not necessarily something that was ever promised to anybody in life, that anything good and successful is always going to be easy. So I looked at this premise that we acknowledge the fact that this is God's will for Joseph to be where he is at the moment. We mentioned a couple episodes ago the place that Jesus had. He was put into the prison where the king's guards, what prisoners would be. This is the place God had him. We talked about places God has us. If we accept God's sovereignty and his goodness and we're right with God and we're doing right, and yet we still find ourselves in a place that we'd rather be different or circumstance, we need to embrace the sovereignty and the goodness of God. And we need to be faithful in that place because God has allowed us. So let's look at a couple things with that thinking in mind in Genesis chapter 40, down in verse 5. Now this is referencing, they just got done talking about the butler and the baker who were now in the prison with Joseph. Verse 5 says, "And they dreamed a dream, both of them, each man his dream in one night, each man according to the interpretation of his dream, the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, which were bound in the prison. And Joseph came in unto them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of his Lord's house, saying, Wherefore look ye so sadly today? And they said, We have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpretation of it. And Joseph said unto them, Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me then, I pray you." So let me just give you a couple things that I see digging into, just kind of evaluating this and looking at it, that I think are great, helpful tips. It helps us, I think, to get a little bit of the mindset of Joseph. But boy, they're truths that I think we need so much today. Number one, we see the patience of Joseph. You don't see Joseph complaining. Joseph, as you know, not long ago, God had placed him, had made him prosper in the eyes of the guard, and so now he's running the prison, per se. He wasn't complaining. He wasn't trying to find out the way to get out. He could have just sat back and said, Listen, I'm in jail, I'm in prison, I'm not doing all this work. But no, he was faithful, he was patient. I believe that Joseph realized that however all of this was unfair, whatever you want to see, somehow it was God's work. How it was going to work out, we're not sure, but somehow it was God's work and God was going to use this for good. So he remained faithful. We see a patience. Patience is without a doubt one of the hardest things. I would say everyone, but Americans, we have it harder. I really do. We live in a fast food environment. We live in fast broadband. I mean, we don't even like slow internet anymore. If internet's not real fast, we get mad. If our phone, 4G is not that great, we got to go to 5G. We live in a day where we're constantly trying to find a way to make things quicker, faster. We call it more efficient. Frankly, we just don't like waiting. Just a couple of days ago, my daughter and I pulled into Dunkin' Donuts on the way here to church, and the way in here I was working, and she was doing school from here. And we pulled into Dunkin' Donuts, and there were drive-thru. We're like, should we go in? And we were evaluating which way would be faster to get our drinks. And you look at that, it's really where we find ourselves, isn't it? What is the quickest way, the fastest way to do something? And that's really a lot of where it's easy to find if we're not careful. Where patience can bring grief into the center of God's will. God has us there. We need to be patient, and that means just trusting and content. And please go back to remember what Paul said. He said, I have learned in whatever state I am therewith to be content. He said, I have learned to be content. It was not natural. I have to choose this where God has me, and I will learn contentment in the center of this. So the first thing I notice is that we just notice here, because there's really nothing said anything about except the patience of Joseph. But here's another thing, is we see his faithfulness. Now, why is that different? So Joseph, verse 6, came into them in the morning and looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. Joseph's doing is he's serving the different prisoners. Why would he have to do that? He's in prison too, but he's serving the prisoners. And he recognized this. So we see the faithfulness. He was still involved. He was still doing what he asked in the midst of an uncomfortable circumstance. But not only faithfulness here, we see his willingness to serve in the center of God's will. He sees these two men. I don't know if he looked down and said, hey, I want to get out of here, but he noticed they were sad. I want you to consider something, all right? Let me see if I can find exactly what I'm looking for. Oh, he said, the end of verse 6, behold, they were sad. And he asked Pharaoh's officers that were with him in the ward of the Lord's house, saying, wherefore look ye so sadly today? Here's a thought. They're in prison. It probably was not abnormal to see two men sad. I mean, you think about it. If you find, in the midst of the pandemic over the last year, it is not hard to find somebody who's having a bad day. It's not hard to find the circumstances of our current scenario to be overwhelming. It's not complicated to do that. They're in prison, and more than likely, they know if I'm in prison, I'm probably going to die, if not here in prison, somewhere. This is the king's prison. These are serious offenses. And he sees it's not a good situation. Joseph had gotten to know them enough to be able to recognize the sadness of it. And he doesn't sit back and no big deal. He talks to them. So he's faithful and he's serving. I just see somebody who, instead of looking at a scenario and getting angry that it wasn't what he wanted to be, he looked at a scenario and he saw nothing but an opportunity to serve the ones that he's been placed over. He says, listen, God's put me here. It's my job. I'm going to go ahead and do that. There are circumstances in the will of God where we go from where we are to where we believe God wants us to be, or where God is moving us. Where the circumstances are not always going to be everything we want. They're not always going to be pleasant, and they aren't always going to be to our strengths. Because the premise of the Holy Spirit infusing His power into us is that we recognize that when we do things for God, they're not just in our own strength. They can't be in our strength. They have to be God infusing His power into us. You're not going to do that if everything in front of you is in your own comfort zone. You have to be out of your comfort zone, allowing God to work and to teach and to work through you. And so sometimes we're going to find ourselves, man, I wish this was different. That's fine. That's okay, but that doesn't mean God can't work through those times. So I see His patience and His faithfulness and then His service as He serves them. But here's an interesting one. Verse 8, he says, and they said unto him, we have dreamed a dream, and there is no interpreter of it. And Joseph said unto them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me them, I pray thee. You notice that in the midst of this, let's say the number from the time he was sold into slavery till now, till he gets to the palace is 13 years. I know some people believe that. That means this is 2 years prior, because from the moment this happens, there's 2 more years before he's moved to the palace. For 11 years, he's been believed dead. For 11 years, he's been nobody. He's been in slavery. He's been lied about. Now he's in prison. And he comes, and what does he do? Gives the glory to God, continues to point back to God. He's the God. He's the goodness. He's the right one. So tell me, and let God work through me. He was still usable by God because his trust in God was still strong. I was mentioning this just not too long ago to my kids, and I think this is something that I think we sometimes miss. We read the story, and we see, this is verse 8 and 9, at the end of verse 40, he still hadn't been told, and then a couple of verses later, then all of a sudden he's released from prison. We don't see the 2 more years. I look at the pandemic. We are about in February. The pandemic, when it came to the massive effects of here in the country, the lockdown and everything, didn't start to March. We are still less than a year away from all of this starting. And most of us look back and say it's been a long year. He was there 13 of those before God put him in the right place, before he could recognize what God was doing. So often we want things to be quick and we miss that God says, this year I can use you and prepare you for what's next. I'm not promising it'll be easy, but I'm promising he's faithful and he knows what he's doing in it. So what do? We trust in God. We move forward. Now let me encourage you. I know that the 3 or 4 thoughts that I've brought out from these verses are, shall I say, a bit redundant. If you go back over the last 18 episodes that we have done talking about the story of Joseph, you're going to find that the 4 I've stated have somehow been repeated. You would have heard them again some other time. But I think there's such a need for redundancy and repetition in these areas because we struggle with patience. Shall I say we struggle with faithfulness. We want things to be our way right now. If not, bam, I'm out and I'm going to go to something better. We struggle with faithfulness. Frankly, we struggle with commitment. Our country, our culture just dictates no faithfulness, no commitment. If I'm not getting what I want, what's best for me, I'm out of here. There's no commitment, very minimal commitment today and in marriage and just about everything. As a matter of fact, for you to commit to somebody for your life and say, I'm not planning divorce, people look at you like you're nuts. Prenups and all these different things. There's so many ways to be involved without commitment. And God has said, I'm asking you to be faithful to me, and I'm asking you to be faithful and commit to me, even when what you're going through doesn't seem right. I'm in charge. Remain faithful. It's easy to say, not always easy to do. And there's no doubt about that. We struggle being patient and we're faithful and serving in the midst of it. I don't want to serve. I'm in prison. This is not fair. I'm just going to stop. And we just sit until God blesses us. Instead of saying, God, I don't like where I'm at, but I'm going to go serve. But then, when it's all done, we can sit back and say, God, it's not fair, but that's not what happened. What did he do? God, I still want to honor you to people who otherwise would not recognize you. I look at these 4 principles, and to me, they're just encouraging because it's a reminder of what I strive to be in good times and in bad. And may that be our goal. May that be our desire to honor God in these times, in this same scenario. Thank you so much for starting off the week with us this week. We hope yesterday was an encouragement to you, and we look forward to a great week. This Wednesday, we are starting our Wednesday night Bible study back in the auditorium. So all the classes are being merged to one class in the auditorium. There'll be a time for just a couple songs, a time for the lesson, a time for Bible study and prayer. So all that'll be included. We're going to try to use both sides of the auditorium so we can have plenty of room for social distancing. And so we're going to live stream it as well. But again, live stream is going to be a little different because of the setup. And so probably what we're thinking of doing is starting with the prayer meeting. So that way, I'm just afraid of letting people give their prayer request and knowing it's going to go all over the internet. So we might even start after the prayer time. So we just want you to know this is coming. So if you say, I love to be back on property, but the classrooms are just not big enough for me, we'd love to invite you back Wednesday, 7 o'clock here on property. I think it'd be an encouragement. I hope you'll come and join us. And we hope it can be a great time of encouragement. Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.